Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, September 15th, where we are continuing our introduction to the class, specifically by talking about H.P. Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature. And last class we talked a little bit about Stephen King and his text Danse Macabre. And while we didn't necessarily read all of it, I had assigned several chapters where Stephen King was talking about his philosophy about writing in this genre. And Stephen King would have been well versed in authors such as H.P. Lovecraft. In fact, supernatural horror in literature was considered to be the definitive text of the time. Now, you can see that there's a great difference in writing style between Stephen King, who's much more informal and colloquial, as opposed to H.P. Lovecraft. Part of that probably has to do with time period, because Stephen King is our contemporary and H.P. Lovecraft was prior to our own time. But in addition to that, I think that H.P. Lovecraft shows a great deal of his personality in terms of his writing, when he is very much trying to, I think, impress the reader. He's known as an Anglophile, and that ultimately he is trying to use the affectations of British society. We see lots of British spellings, for instance, and lots of references to texts that probably you and I have not read. And I doubt most people have. It goes to show the incredible ability that H.P. Lovecraft has to read and understand the genre as a whole. So if nothing else, he's a historian in this particular piece. And in supernatural horror in literature, this essay, which is a rather long essay, it's over 100 pages, gives us his perspective, which is somewhat similar to Stephen King's, although it does deviate in some ways, to the genre of supernatural writing or Gothic or horror. And that's one of the things we were talking about last class, is terminology, and that while all of this terminology has some similarity to it, there also is some difference associated with it as well. When we're talking about the supernatural, we're talking about that which defies the natural order of the universe, or basically something that cannot happen through natural means, as opposed to something like science fiction, which means that science can explain what is occurring. It's just the science of the time has not reached that level of scientific discovery. And then fantasy, that which is set in a completely different alternate universe altogether. And regardless of whether or not you want to talk about Gothic literature, which has its origins in the term Gothic, as we talked about last class, the great architectural term about these huge, magnificent structures that at the time were considered grotesque, as well as thinking about the Goths, these barbarians who basically invaded. Or we want to talk about horror, that's that which frightens or scares, or we want to talk about supernatural, or we want to even talk about something like science fiction or fantasy. Regardless of these, that from H.P. Lovecraft's perspective, fear is the oldest and the strangest emotion of humankind. And that's one of the reasons why these particular texts happen to appeal to readers. The idea of the unknown, the uncertainty and danger of the world is, according to Lovecraft, and I think I agree, is our oldest and strangest fear that begins with our primitive forefathers, and it probably starts for us at the moment of birth. Lovecraft also gives us a few terms. He talks about the macabre, which was a term that Stephen King used as well in Danse Macabre, that which is gruesome, horrifying, or grotesque. He also talks about the weird, and that he differentiates the weird from the macabre by saying the weird is the supernatural, that which is unearthly or uncanny. In fact, we're going to talk about this idea of uncanny a little bit more as the semester progresses. It was an idea actually that Sigmund Freud examined. And that a reader, in order to be able to appreciate these texts, must have a certain level of imagination. They must be able to suspend disbelief. And they need to have a certain level of detachment from everyday life, again, in order to accept this alternate possibility. And The essay is divided into chapters. The first being the introduction, and this is where we're told about the importance of atmosphere and the atmosphere of dread. And I had talked a little bit about this last class as well, and that oftentimes the Gothic is characterized by its use of atmosphere, and that which is considered to be frightening or is considered to be in one way or another horrific. And then the second chapter, the dawn of the horror tale, you can see how H.P. Lovecraft is also going back and forth with some of his terminology. And the early Gothic novel. And we had talked about the Castle of Otranto as helping to establish some of the traditions of the Gothic novel. That was written in 1764 by Horace Walpole. Wasn't particularly well written. But if you did want to check it out for whatever reason, you can see in the notes below, I've included a link to that text if you wanted to skim it or even read it in its entirety. But again, I think its importance is more about helping to establish the conventions of the tradition of Gothic and less about the quality of itself as a standalone text. And those conventions are things like castles, and that makes sense when you think about how one of the origins of Gothic is an architectural term from these great big cathedrals that were considered to be grotesque. Villains, and perhaps that also is not that surprising when we think about another origin of Gothic, is a historical one about conquering invaders, barbarians. Persecuted heroines, and this is something we're going to be talking about over the course of the semester, is that the female is oftentimes presented as helpless and passive. The hero, the savior in the text. And of course that atmosphere that is all important. Fog, trapdoors, creaking hinges, strange lights, things of that nature. And then Lovecraft continues and talks about the apex of the Gothic romance, because I believe I mentioned Anne Radcliffe last class, where the Gothic was oftentimes tied with some sort of a romance, less so in terms of more contemporary Gothic texts. And then he discusses the aftermath of Gothic fiction in chapter 5, spectral literature on the continent, Edgar Allan Poe, chapter 7, so Poe gets an entirety of a chapter, which goes to show how much Lovecraft admires and respects Edgar Allan Poe. Chapter 8, the weird tradition in America. Chapter 9, the weird tradition in Britain. And then lastly, the modern masters, or at least that would have been from Lovecraft's perspective during his particular time period. In chapter 5, when Lovecraft talks about the aftermath of Gothic fiction, he mentions two texts that we are reading this semester, and two texts that are very iconic, Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And certainly we talked about how whether or not individuals have experience with reading these texts or even watching movie versions of these texts, they probably have some understanding of these texts just because they've become cultural icons in our society. So that's one of the things that we'll be talking about over the course of the semester, is how did these texts capture imaginations and so forcefully that basically all of us have an understanding, however vague it might be, about a Frankenstein or a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In fact, it's become part of our common language, our common lexicon. And then in chapter 7, we have a complete chapter devoted to Edgar Allan Poe. Now, prior to this, and even after this, we get a lot of name dropping with a lot of authors that we probably haven't heard of before, and I don't want you to be anxious about that. What basically I want you to focus on are some of the major themes that Lovecraft is talking about, and some of the texts that we will be examining in class. And when he talks about Edgar Allan Poe, he talks about his great admiration for Poe because of Poe's standard of realism and Poe's sophisticated use of psychology. And in fact, in terms of Edgar Allan Poe, he oftentimes is credited with creating the modern day short story in the way that we think of the modern day short story. Poe is also credited with creating the modern-day mystery story, and that's another genre that oftentimes has comparable or at least some common characteristics with horror, gothic, or science fiction, or even with fantasy, that there's some unknown mystery that needs to be solved on one level or another. Two short stories that are mentioned in that section on Edgar Allan Poe are The Masque of Red Death and The Fall of the House of Usher. We will be reading both over the course of this semester, as well as a couple of others. You may have some familiarity with these stories, or at least with Edgar Allan Poe. He oftentimes is read in the junior high school and high school level. That's usually where most readers get their first introduction to Edgar Allan Poe. I think partly because of the genre of short story, so it's more accessible than, let's say, a novel. Also, I think his stories are dark enough and deviant enough to sort of arouse reader curiosity, but yet they aren't as grotesque as the gross out that Stephen King talks about. So they walk that fine line, so to speak. And then he continues on in chapter 8 and talks about the weird tradition in America. A couple of texts, one in particular, Henry James Return of the Screw, is a text that I used to actually include in this particular class, which is a great example of the creation of ghost story. That said, one of the problems is time, so what I wanted to make sure of was that we had enough time to read the iconic text, so I deleted that, and I've got the Haunting of Hill House instead as our example of ghost story. It's a more contemporary text. It's also written by a female author, so I thought that would be quite interesting. But James's Return of the Screw is, at least in terms of this genre, quite iconic. You might have heard of The Yellow Wallpaper as well by Perkins Gilman, and that's another text, short story, that oftentimes is identified as a kind of weird tale. And then in chapter 9, The Weird Tradition in British Isles. Again, is a couple of texts that you might be familiar with. You might have heard of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, which again, it was almost added to this class, but because of time constraints, I realized that wasn't realistic. However, when we start to read some of H.P. Lovecraft's own works, we'll see that one of his short stories that we'll be reading actually references The Picture of Dorian Gray. At least it infers that, or it suggests that its content is in one way or another similar to The Picture of Dorian Gray. And Dracula, of course, which is going to be another iconic text that we are going to be reading in the course of this semester. And that from Lovecraft's perspective, the best horror tales have a sense of naturalness to them. In other words, they're realistic enough so that we could accept them as a possibility. They can convince us that this is indeed happening and that this world exists. That there's an artistry associated with the language, with the writing. And that's something that we usually talk about with all pieces of literature, and that more often than not distinguishes formulaic literature that's written purely for profit or entertainment, as opposed to literature that is much more complex, and literature that requires much more from the reader, and that oftentimes it's a creative and unusual use of language, as well as a creative and unusual approach to things like symbolism and metaphor and all of the other literary elements that we've studied that make it such a powerful piece. That you've got a certain level of craftsmanship and technique. There's a psychological knowledge associated with this kind of writing, an exotic atmosphere, and a supernatural element. And I believe last class I talked about that we could go all the way back to the literary tradition for something like Macbeth as a great example of a piece of literature that also embraces the supernatural and has a good number of Gothic elements associated with it. The same could be said of Beowulf, which is a great epic poem with one of perhaps the most famous monsters in literary history, Grendel, and even more importantly, Grendel's mother. And even something like Dr. Faustus, which was a play that was written during Shakespeare's time, about a man who sells his soul to the devil for infinite knowledge, and let's just say it doesn't go well. It was written by Christopher Marlowe. So there's a long literary tradition here about utilizing some of these elements. And if we wanted to, we could read some very canonical literary pieces from the lens of the supernatural. But this particular class focuses specifically on texts that have been characterized primarily as Gothic, which means that these iconic Frankensteins, Draculas, and Dr. Jekylls and Mr. Hydes will be front and center in the class. So as far as I'm concerned, this is basically the ending of sort of our introduction to Gothic literature, and now we get to actually read some iconic texts. And we begin with Frankenstein. It was written by Mary Shelley. This is very interesting that a female was writing this text in a genre that's very male-dominated that we're going to be talking about next class. And you can see in the notes below, I found a link where you could access Frankenstein, so that if it turns out that you are unable to get the text, you can at least find it online. And what would happen is that ideally, next class, you would have Frankenstein read in its entirety, though I'm quite aware that the ideal is not oftentimes possible. And you would have noticed that we've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein. That's very deliberate, so that we can talk about the text in pieces, and then we can also, at one point or another, talk about film, which is what we're going to be doing with Frankenstein as well. So try to read as much of it as you can. The idea is that while we're talking about Frankenstein, you're moving forward to the next text. And as you know, there are writing assignments that are components of this class, and what we've got are journals. The informal writing assignments where you are writing a response to each of the major Gothic texts. Your first journal won't be due until the 29th, and that is going to be a Wednesday, and that's going to be on Frankenstein. So basically, by that point, we would have had several classes devoted to Frankenstein. So you would have also read some of your classmates' comments on the class discussion forums about Frankenstein, seen some of my class videos about Frankenstein, and certainly you can add in your own thoughts and observations about Frankenstein as well. And I'm thinking approximately a page or so, but as long as you think it needs to be, in order for you to write down some of your thoughts and reflections and ideas. Obviously, you could write a book about Frankenstein. You could write a book about any of these Gothic texts. For those of you who wanted to write more than what I'm asking for in a journal, you might want to consider writing about that text in an academic paper, where you would have about approximately 4 to 5 pages to analyze something more in depth. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as the semester progresses. But for those of you who are already beginning your reading of Frankenstein, you might want to begin sort of contemplating what you might want to discuss in a journal. Again, I don't grade the journals in a letter grade system because they're supposed to be informal. I grade them informally. So on a checkmark system, with a plus being excellent, a check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory, check minus less than satisfactory, a minus unsatisfactory. And think of it as a kind of conversation on paper where you can write thoughts and observations and comments about the text. I'm not looking for anything in particular. It's as if you and I were having a conversation about Frankenstein. So, but we can talk more about the journals as we get a little bit closer to that, but I did want to mention them somewhat because now we're transitioning away from our introduction and actually beginning to read some of the Gothic texts. And I put them in chronological order so that you could see a sense of progression over the course of the semester. So for today's attendance question, what I thought I would ask is about Gothic literature, since that's what we've been talking about over the past couple of classes. Based on everything that you've read and everything that I've talked about and your classmates have discussed in the discussion forums, my question is, how would you define Gothic literature and why? Because ultimately, as we've discussed, there are lots of different ways that you can define the term Gothic and Gothic literature. I think about the definition that oftentimes is used for pornography, actually, that it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. I think there's a certain level of truth to that in Gothic literature, but nevertheless, to try to get something a little bit more concrete than that, I'm asking you to try to define it in your own words. And ultimately, as I indicated, you don't need to respond to the comments of your classmates, but I do want you to read the comments from your classmates and also my comments to them, and that'll give you a good overview of what it is that we would have discussed in class. And if it turns out that you need additional time for whatever reason for any of the assignments, please just ask me and I'll be happy to give you an extension, so you shouldn't be worried about that. But my hope is that most, if not all of you, can answer this question of how do you define Gothic literature and why by the 16th, which is Thursday at 8 a.m. And it doesn't have to be a very detailed answer, but I suspect that when we put all of the responses together, we'll probably have a nice overview of the foundation of what this class is that we could use as we move forward into Frankenstein. So I hope you are all doing well. I am doing well. And next class, we will start with our first major text, Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.